You're listening to an IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education. Powered by UCL Minds.
This is Research for the Real World. Conversations with researchers about the paths they've taken to shape our everyday lives.
This is Research for the Real World. I'm Sam Sims. I'm a lecturer at the UCL Institute of Education. And on this episode, I'm talking to Francis Green, Professor of Work and Education Economics. Francis researches education, training, work quality, and industrial relations. He's affiliated with the Centre for Learning and Life Chances in Knowledge Economies and Societies, which snappily abbreviates to LLACE, as well as the Centre for Global Higher Education. Francis is the author of over 150 articles and 11 books, the most recent of which is Engines of Privilege, Britain's Private School Problem, which is co-authored with the historian David Kynaston. We're going to talk to Francis today about the changing nature of our working lives, the future of workplace training, and the value of degree-level education, amongst other things. Francis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Hello, Sam, and I'm very, very pleased to be here.
Francis, as I understand it, your undergraduate degree was in physics. So can you tell us, how did you get from studying quarks and black holes to studying the economics of education?
What a question. Yes, well, physics was what I was good at school, and that's what I did as an undergraduate when I was at Oxford. When I finished at Oxford, I went then to do economics at the LSE, and then didn't know what really to do with my life as a young man of about 22, 23. And I had two interviews for jobs the same day. One was to be a social worker, and the other one was to be a lecturer at Kingston Polytechnic. And I rang both of them up and asked them if they would be able to and willing to change the day, and neither of them agreed. So I had to make a choice without even trying. And I plummeted for Kingston Polytechnic and spent a happy 13 or so years there. In the course of that time, I'd acquired my PhD, which was in economics, of course, because I'm an economist. And in particular, I started to get interested in political economy and issues to do with the labour market, to the nature of work and how wages are determined and things like that. And throughout the 1980s, that's what I worked on. I got more and more interested in labour and labour economics. And it doesn't then take that long for you to get interested in education, because what determines what happens in the labour market is the education that you receive before you join the labour market. And I would say ever since, from about the 1990 onwards, my work, my teaching and my research has always centred around issues to do with labour and education and the interface between the two. That's what I teach. That's what I try and write about in terms of policy, particularly focusing on British policy. In recent years, I joined the UCL Institute of Education, perhaps not so recent now. This was in 2011. And that really brought my interest in the economics of education and schooling to the fore. So I've concentrated quite a bit on that since then.
Thanks. And you mentioned there your interest in job quality and the nature of work. And there's now quite a large literature on this, which you've contributed to. So what have we learned from all this data crunching about, what makes for the ideal job?
Yes, probably not the easiest of questions, but what we've learned over the last 20 years, I wrote a book called Demanding Work back in 2006, which had the thesis that despite the affluence of modern economies, including Britain's, despite the way that the gross national product was inevitably increasing every year, and indeed in Britain, wages were increasing every year, What we didn't see is an increase in other aspects of job quality. In certain other aspects, we found that people were getting more stressed, work intensity was increasing, the amount of control people felt they had over their work was decreasing. We detected all these changes, these long-term changes, using surveys, which I and one or two other colleagues had been conducting over the years. So what we arrived at from that body of research was a view that a good job has several dimensions. And when I came to work for the European Commission a few years later about this, we essentially hit upon 7 main dimensions of work. Of course, pay is perhaps the first one people think about. How much does a job pay? But it's also a question of the prospects. Is the job secure? Is there some chance that you're going to lose that job in the next year? Or on the other hand, what are the chances of promotion and improving your pay in that job in the future? Then there's the question of the working time, the quality of the working time. Do you have to work very long hours, or do you have to work very uneven hours, or do you have control over the hours? And then there's several intrinsic aspects of the job, how hard you have to work, the skills that you come to deploy, and the physical working conditions, and indeed the social working conditions. Do you get on well with your boss and your co-workers? So if you ask me what's an ideal job, it's basically one that's high on all those 7 dimensions: pay, the prospects of the job, the working time quality, and the various intrinsic aspects. Are you able to avoid intense working pressures? Are you able to deploy the skills that you have? Are the working conditions good, or do you have to work in like freezing working conditions or something? And finally, are your co-workers supportive? So a good job is essentially one that's good on all those dimensions. Really good jobs are pretty rare, of course, and some jobs are good on some dimensions and good on others. And what my work has been able to do is to convince certain policymakers, particularly in the European Foundation for Living and Working Conditions, which is part of the European Commission, it's been able to convince them to think in terms of these 7 dimensions of job quality and not just think in one dimension, pay. So yes, I'm an economist, and perhaps you might say, Sam, that an economist should think about pay because that's the numbers and so on. But I find myself working in a multidisciplinary way, taking into account what the sociologists and the psychologists say about work, and insisting that we do look at jobs as multidimensional things which we need to think about.
And so I think you said you were originally doing this research, Francis, in the noughties, the 2000s, and then you moved to the IOE in 2011. So can we take it that you concluded that the IOE was the ideal place to work based on all this research?
The IOE was a wonderful opportunity for me. I'd been teaching economics for several decades, and towards the end of the noughties, I was looking for something new, and I was very pleased to be offered the opportunity to come to work in Lakes. And it was a change of direction for me because although I'm an economist and continue to work as an economist, it really put me in working amongst non-economists, among sociologists and psychologists. So this was an ideal job for me, and it was also a challenge to do so.
And you mentioned there in your list of the 7 dimensions of job quality, one of them was how hard do you have to work? And I'm interested in this in particular because sometimes people work very hard in their job because they're passionate about it and super motivated by it. I'm guessing that wouldn't count as a negative in your framework and in your research. So what is it about? When does work become too much?
Yeah, it's hard to pinpoint the exact stage, but what my research shows is that really there are 2 parts to work effort. One is, of course, how long you work. What I've looked at most of all is the pressure, that the intensity with which you work in any given number of hours. Now, what you're alluding to, Sam, just there is that if your job is kind of really loose and you don't have much to do at work and you're hanging around, most people would get rather disillusioned and bored with it. So you do need a certain amount of work being pushed your way, certain quantity of tasks, as it were, being pushed your way in order to feel that you're contributing. However, beyond a certain point, the impact on your health and well-being is being shown to be negative. And for the most part, people are beyond that point, and they would prefer to work slightly less intensively, have more breaks, more sort of gaps in the working day. I'm not necessarily talking about long lunch breaks, but I'm just talking about moments when you can pause before you move from one task to a next. I'm talking about not having a succession of really intensive tasks which occupy your attention and your emotional energy. So we've devised a number of questions for the surveys which we administer over the years to try and tap the different dimensions of this work pressure. I don't think any one dimension is adequate, but we found that all the dimensions we looked at were getting worse over the years. The first data point we have actually is 1990, and we've been tracking this every 5 years or so. So,
wow,
yes, it's the intensification of work is something which we have seen in lots and lots of different occupations, not only in Britain, but in a number of other countries as well. And it's not good for our well-being. It's not just something which low-skilled workers have been doing. It's something that high-skilled workers have been doing as well. So alongside long working hours, we need to control the intensity of work. Now, it's not just the intensity, but it's also how much control we have over our work, what we're going to do and how we're going to do it and so on. And there's plenty of psychological and medical evidence now that people who have to work extremely intensively and have little control over their work are much more likely to suffer health conditions through their work. So there are indications that the amount of people working through stress and suffering potential days off work have been increasing over the years, not just in Britain, but also elsewhere. So that's essentially what that pit of the work is around, the intensification of work, what's implications of it, and where does it come from? Why are we working so much harder than before?
Yeah, I was struck by your point there about, people just having opportunities to pause during the working day. And during the pandemic, people have been Zooming a lot more, spending a lot more time on video calls. And particularly some of my senior colleagues feel that they have back-to-back Zoom calls all day, which is a perfect example of never having a chance to pause. Is there any evidence that technology is a driver of this kind of long-run increase in intensity?
There is indeed, yes. It does seem to hit people who work with computers and work with computers more intensively. There is really some theory behind this, which is given this rather grand name of effort-biased technological change, which is what I build some of my papers on. But it's not only technological change, it's organizational change. And new ways of working which get brought in over the years, working in certain kinds of teams and the use of things like just-in-time technologies and so on. Alongside new technologies, what we find is two things. First of all, it's possible to work harder than we used to be able to. That is to say that employers find it easier to schedule your work so that it comes on time and it's there for you to do. I'll give an example from a really interesting study which was done of hotel workers way back in the late 1990s, where the employers were able to use the technology that they had to schedule the demand for chambermaids, so that whereas before chambermaids would quite often have moments when there were plenty of chambermaids there in the hotel, but there weren't many beds taken up, and so they had a little bit of an easier time, frankly. But the technology comes in, and now they have a very good model of forecasting the demand for hotel rooms to be cleared, and therefore the number of chambermaids to take on. And so when the chambermaid is there, then that her work is then completely taken up. There's no gaps. And so that's just one example. There's a terrific paper about it, but we see it elsewhere. We see in call centers, for example. It's implicit in the call center technology that as soon as you finish one call, boom, the next call comes in.
Right. Right.
You don't have a chance to have so that's what we call effort-biased technological change. On top of that, it also, of course, gives employers the opportunity to monitor what their workers are doing. There was an interesting example in the paper the other day that I read that Amazon was now selling, I think, this potential to really closely observe what employees were doing. Now, it doesn't mean to say that employers necessarily use that, but being very closely observed obviously gives much more power and control to the employer to make sure that there's no moments of idleness amongst their employees.
Yeah. So this idea of effort bias technological change, I guess it means that the way that technology is developing in the workplace is pushing us is biased towards more effortful jobs, as opposed to, for example, the invention of the automatic washing machine or tumble dryer, which is kind of biased. Is that right?
That's a good observation. It's one of the ironies, and comes back to the point that the technology is how you use it. In the end of the day, it can be used beneficially, but the opposite as well. So exactly. So. But in general, it seems the case that where technology is used, at least over the last 20 years or so, it tends to be in those jobs where we see the greater amount of intensification. Now, I should say that's not the only thing which has been intensifying work, in my view. There are other kinds of jobs where the work is intensified simply because more work is given. And I'll give you an example of hospitals, where there have been a number of studies tracking the increasing intensification of nurses' work. And the way that works is simply that if you increase the patient flow through wards, then the nature of nursing is a caring occupation. The nurses can't refuse to treat the patients that are in the ward, and they just do it. But they have to treat more, to attend to more patients. And so it works very slowly. Maybe it doesn't work overnight. But the fact is that the patient flow in hospitals nowadays is much more than it used to be. And nurses therefore have fewer moments to stand aside and mop the brow and so on and so forth. So that is, to me, that is a question of the power of employers to impose those changes in the pace of work. With the decline of trade union power and various other elements of worker bargaining power, that seems to be what's happening.
And one area which I know you've done research on, Francis, or one industry or sector, is teaching. What have you found about the intensification or otherwise of teaching?
Well, teachers are, in this case, they're at an amazing extreme, particularly the last 10 years, I would say. It just stares out at me from the data when I look at it. I should say that this data, these surveys we've been collecting, as I said before, since 1990. The latest one was in 2017. And it shows that the responses that teachers have been giving to these questions about work intensity are stronger than pretty well any other occupation in Britain. So something like 90% of teachers will tell you that they very strongly agree that their job requires them to work at a very hard pace. Now, that compares with something like 50% or so of the average worker. So normal teacher's job is very, very intense, and it has become so, especially in the last 10 or 15 years. And to me, that's probably an important reason why the issue of keeping teachers, stopping them moving out of the profession or moving out elsewhere into teachers' jobs elsewhere or in the private sector, to me, that's probably more important than the lengthening of teachers' hours. Teachers have always worked long hours during term times, but what seems to have changed is the intensification of those hours. And I feel that this is something that needs to be looked into more. It's obviously, people are obviously aware of the problem of workload, but then they think, well, workload, that just means the hours they work. It's not, it's the intensification that they work during those hours. And the moment that they just don't have those moments to pause, to chat perhaps with their colleagues over a cup of coffee in the staff room. Those are the things which have been changed over the years.
Interesting. Yeah. I've seen some calculations that teachers' annual working hours, despite having school holidays when they're not working, obviously, are comparable to other professions. And so you've got this, they're almost working a sort of compressed hours schedule where, not working in the holidays, but then working longer hours during the term time. And now, kind of on top of that slightly intense work schedule, you've got the intensification of the hours within those compressed shifts. So, yeah, perhaps that's one of the reasons why it stands out.
Just the icing on that is the other finding from the data, which suggests that they feel they've got less control than they used to. That's what they report in the answers to the questions on my surveys. They feel that they've got less discretion over how they do their teaching and how hard they work and the quality standards to which they work. And that brings me to that psychological point that I mentioned about 10 minutes ago, that if you're in a situation where you have low levels of control, but at the same time you're working very intensely, that's when your health is put at risk. And that's when you find situations of high strain. So if I was a young teacher now starting out on the job, I'd want to be fairly robust, I think, in order to see my way through those especially difficult early years of teaching.
Yeah, it's so fascinating because teaching used to be thought of as a very high autonomy job, perhaps not autonomy over time and when the work is done, but within the classroom, the teacher used to be seen as having a high degree of autonomy. And I think that was right. So very interesting to sort of reflect on why that has changed. I think to some extent, technology's played a role in the change of the job of teaching. Teachers spend a lot more time, as I understand it, kind of collecting assessment data and submitting it centrally. And that's one way in which the job is changed. But the control over the way in which they do teaching and teach in a lesson, I've never found a satisfactory explanation for that. Do your surveys suggest anything there?
Well, it doesn't. These are not surveys specifically of teachers, I should say. They're surveys of the whole workforce. So they're kind of like generic questions. So they don't specifically ask about the job of teaching and what goes on in the classroom. But I'm fairly sure, from my own experience, after all, you and I, we're also teachers insofar as we lecture to undergraduate students. It's just different ages. I'm fairly sure that we're also seeing reductions of autonomy in the classroom. And I think that's likely to be much more important for teachers than for university lecturers. University lecturers nowadays are sort of controlled about the structure of the lectures that they give. But when I started giving lectures, nobody cared really much how I gave my lectures, as long as the students got through. But nowadays we're told, oh, well, the lecture must begin in this way and then move on in that way and finish in that other way. And I suspect that in the average teacher lesson is much more controlled and directed than it used to be. And this is partly what teachers are saying when they say how much control they have.
Interesting. Yeah, and another interesting parallel here is with the medical profession, and in particular doctors, where I've seen it been argued in both directions, actually, that an increase in evidence-based practice can lead to additional tasks for doctors around submitting data and information to be studied, and also create constraints, and we might think they're good, productive constraints on practice. I wonder if there's something akin to that going on in education as well.
I think those are examples of simply adding new tasks to a job, really. And often that is associated with learning and development and good things like that. We're supposed to be in a knowledge economy where all jobs involve learning continually, but it's forgotten that actually takes up energy and time. And these are new things. Those new tasks you were just referring to in medicine are paralleled by the new tasks which have been required of school teachers in the last 10 years. Some of it for good reasons, but others for plain reasons of bureaucracy and control, which don't seem to necessarily add to the quality of the teaching that's provided to the children. So I applaud efforts to find ways of reducing those, if you like, bureaucratic controls over teaching. I applaud efforts to give teachers more autonomy wherever possible, to put their own personality into the teaching, and wherever that happens, you'll get a better quality.
So staying with this theme of your research around change in the labour market, Britain's obviously just about to experience a major upheaval, or the UK, the ending of freedom of movement from Europe. And it strikes me that supporters of this reform on both the left and right of politics have argued that this will incentivize or even force firms to focus on training up of local workers as opposed to using migrant labour from the continent. Do you buy that argument? Are we going to see a flowering of workplace training?
I can't give you a definitive answer to that. I hope we're going to see an increase in training and an increase in the quality of training. I think it is extremely important when you think about the progression in the future for an affluent economy such as Britain's. It's depending on innovation, bringing in new ways of doing things over time, especially as AI and robotics comes in. And it has to be remembered that, even if we're looking at 2030, 2035, 2040, most of the people in the labour market then are already in the labour market now. They're not in education. Most of the people in 2040 will have left school by now. And so if we're to have a more skilled workforce in the future, in the near future, then we're going to have to think about upskilling our workforce. And I hate to be a harbinger of bad news all the time, but another part of my work has been looking at the trends in the training of the workforce. And we found that over a long period of time, with exceptions for a few years, there's been a decline in the amount of training that goes on. I'm talking about people who are in work already, and they're given training either by their employer or they initiate it themselves. And we can track whether they participate in training and how long they spend doing it. And it's really gone down by a substantial amount since the late 1990s. I've recently been looking at what's been happening in the last 10 years, up to about 2015, from the end of the post-financial crisis period, when the financial crisis happened in 2008-9. In the years following that, there was something of an increase in the amount of training going on. But since then, I'm afraid, since about 2014 and 15, it's been declining. And there's evidence that in the COVID period, it's actually gone down a little bit more, though not drastically, as one might have expected, even worse. But fortunately, people who've been laid out on furlough do seem to be spending some of their time doing some training, which is good. But the big question is the one you posed. Will Brexit make a difference? Is it the case that employers will say, no, I can't get my apple pickers. I live in Kent, so I think about apple pickers. I can't get my apple pickers from home, or I can't get my skilled workers also from abroad so much. Therefore, I must train up my existing workforce. We must put in some apprenticeships. We should train our older workers and so on. The next 2 years or so will tell. There's no evidence for it yet in the data. Up till the end of 2020, we see no uptick in the amount of training going on. But of course, we've got these two big whammies hitting the economy at the moment. We've got both COVID and Brexit. So I'm not saying that I would have expected to see an uptick so soon. But if you ask me in a year's time, I would expect to see an upturn if Brexit's going to work in this way. And it's one of those hypotheses which can only be tested in reality, I think. That I'm not, to be honest, I'm not confident about British employers. In the past, they've often too many of them have taken the relatively easy route of sort of going for the relatively low skilled production methods. There are many, many exceptions, of course, of great employers who have terrific apprenticeship schemes and so on, but there are not enough of them. And we need to find ways to encourage many more of our long tail of non-training employers to take up the challenge in the post-Brexit world. All I can say is that this is a crucial thing, that we cannot expect to become a more prosperous economy if we don't upskill our workforce.
Yeah, and you mentioned there robotics and AI, and the other option for employers who are struggling with labour shortages, of course, is just to invest the money in capital rather than labour.
Yes,
and have a robot picking the apples, which is quite plausible, of course. So the other sort of big disruption that's happening at the moment, as you mentioned, is COVID. And a sector that this has impacted quite a lot is higher education, because the traditional model of higher education relies on having lots of people in a room together. This has led to a debate about the value of higher education as students are kind of, doing their whole degree from their student halls, sat at a desk in their bedroom, essentially, and the value of a degree in 2021. What does the evidence tell us about, the value of higher education? Is it still worthwhile for students, for young people?
On average, yes. And I expect it to continue to be worthwhile on average. There's now some more detailed evidence that studying certain subjects are not well remunerated in the labour market. And there are a number of commentators around, plenty of commentators around, who want to discourage young people from studying such subjects. And we're talking more like arts and humanities subjects. I'm not amongst them. Because I believe that people should choose freely what they want to do what they think is most interesting, particularly at undergraduate level, and become more educated in this way. But I do believe it's right to keep young people fully informed about the labour market consequences of the choices they make. So I don't think that the economic consequences of going to university will change a great deal over the next few years. I know that people who are graduating during this terrible period of the pandemic are going to find it hard to get jobs, and there will be some scarring for a number of years in their careers. At least that's the evidence from previous periods of recession and unemployment. It's bad luck if you happen to graduate at a time of recession. I suspect that the effects of the lockdown, pandemic confinements will be just as strong in the non-economic spheres. That is to say that a university life, in Britain at least, is not just going to lectures and studying books and passing exams. It's a way of life. It's meeting friends. A lot of it is non-academic, but some of it is academic and intellectual. It's an experience. And that's what's being missed if you're locked down or if you're studying from home. So that would be my opinion. The evidence, which is not less my opinion, the evidence on rates of return suggests that despite the increasing numbers of people who go to university these days, it's still better on average to go to university if you can and to graduate and get a degree compared to if you don't. That is to say, if you just go straight into work or look for work.
I think your point, Francis, about the variation by subject, as you say, that's that research has only recently been done, but the findings really are stark in some cases about the different kind of economic and earnings impacts of studying different subjects. For example, I went to school 2000 to 2005, secondary school, and my school was a modern foreign language specialist school. And I was told that this, if we all learned modern foreign languages, this would be great for our career and earnings as adults. But actually this, if I remember correctly, this recent research shows that the amount of additional money you will earn as a male, if you do foreign language degree compared to no degree, is close to zero. I mean, that's really striking.
It's incredible, isn't it? And I think what this recent research, actually, it's not new that subject matter, we know that subject matter, we've known that for some time. But I think it's thrown this into relief. It's highlighted the extent of the differences. The foreign languages thing, that was one that surprised me in these new findings, because it's not just that it's a skill to speak a foreign language, but it's also indication of a skill that you could learn it and do it well. And it's like a general skill as well. Interesting, my workplace surveys have been showing for many years that the task of being able to speak a foreign language other than English is not rewarded in the labour market in Britain. Employers don't feel they have to pay more to someone who could, say, speak French or German just because they're dealing with exporting to these countries. So to that level, it didn't surprise me. But yeah, foreign languages it is quite striking, that, and I would like to try to unpack that rather more. Incidentally, the choice of a different subject also may contain different connotations about yourself rather than the subject, if you see what I mean. In other words, if you choose to do maths, for example, and you successfully do maths, it's generally regarded as an indicator of other levels of ability and other skills, not just math skills. We've known that for some time, that achieving in maths. But it doesn't mean to say that everybody can just suddenly choose to do maths and they'll get more wages. In other words, it's not necessarily a causal explanation of the different rewards in the labour market.
Francis Green, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
That's great. Thanks very much then, Sam.
You can find Francis' research by following him at L Lake Centre on Twitter, and find links to his research in the episode notes. If you have any questions you'd like us to ask future interviewees on the show, please follow the links in the show notes and record your questions there using either voice or text. And if you enjoyed listening to the podcast today, there are now 7 series worth of conversations with IOE researchers, all available from wherever you get your podcasts. And as an added bonus, you can find the Research for the Real World playlist featuring tracks contributed by previous guests and producers. Find the link to Spotify in the show notes. I'm Sam Sims, and this has been Research for the Real World. Goodbye.
Thanks so much for downloading and listening to this IOE podcast from the UCL Institute of Education, University College London.